Welcome to the Bible Journey. My name is Mark Green, and I am the pastor of adult ministries at Otterbine Church. This week we are looking at Mark chapters 8 through 12. If you'll recall, Scene 1, the book of Mark has 3 scenes. Scene 1 is Jesus and the disciples in and around Galilee. Everything happening is in that area. Towards the end of chapter 8, around verse 50 through chapter 10, Jesus and the disciples begin to make their way to Jerusalem. We're going to focus on those 3 chapters today, and I want to suggest to you they sort of form a beginning and end and to Jesus' conversations about discipleship. I want to show you the flow of that. One of the events recorded right before Jesus leaves Galilee is that he heals a blind man. The story is found in Mark 8:22 to 26. Then the last event mentioned before Jesus arrives in Jerusalem is Jesus healing Bartimaeus, another blind man, in chapter 10, verses 46 to 52. These 2 events sort of act as bookends to everything that happens in between, which I think is a focus on discipleship. So let's begin with the first story in Mark chapter 8. Let me read it to you because each healing event has some slight differences that I think Jesus is using to emphasize a point. And they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. That's important. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, "Do not even enter the village." Because the man knew what trees look like, we can probably assume that this man was not born blind, but had become blind at some point later in life. Now, why Jesus uses spit to initiate this process, we don't know, but that's what he chose to do. So why did he lead him out of the village? Only 3 times does Jesus withdraw when he heals someone. In Mark chapter 5, you have the healing of Jairus' daughter, and in Mark chapter 7, Jesus heals a deaf man, and then chapter 8, he heals the blind man. In each instance, Jesus seems to pull the person aside in order to make a more personal connection. In this case, we also notice that the healing is gradual instead of instant. When the text does not specify why Jesus does it this way, but again, it probably implies that the idea is Jesus is building the man's faith as he builds relationship with him. And in response to his healing, the man goes home. The next instance is found at the end of Mark chapter 10, Bartimaeus. Let me read this text to you. And they came to Jericho, and as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a great crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, "Jesus, son of David," that's important, "have mercy on me." And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. But he cried all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus stopped and said, "Call him." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." And throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" And of course the blind man said to him, "Rabbi, let me recover my sight." And Jesus said to him, "Go your way, your faith has made you well." And immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way. You notice some differences between the 2 healings. One is gradual, one is instant. One, he sends him home. One, he follows him. So let me make a few observations about this. Second, the first guy seems to be quiet while Bartimaeus is loud and makes his request aggressively. Second, Bartimaeus addresses Jesus as the Son of God. That's important. It's a messianic phrase. Fourth, the event happens on the road that the Jews would have traveled leading to Jerusalem. The timing is vital. The Feast of Passover is happening soon, and people are making their way to Jerusalem. So in this case, there would have been a large crowd of people, a lot of people heading towards Jerusalem. Fifth, Matthew and Luke record the same event, but only Mark records the response of Bartimaeus in verses 49 and 50. Notice verse 50. Jesus healed Bartimaeus and told him to go your way, as he told many people he had healed. And instead of choosing to go his way, go home, go back to his family and friends, the man chooses to follow Jesus on the way. And here we see the reason for the bookends of the two healing stories. Watch this as we march through chapters 8, 9, and 10, this flow of discipleship. Mark 8 ends with a blind man showing faith, then going home. Mark 9 begins with the transfiguration of Jesus. Jesus revealing his divine glory to Peter, James, and John, with the emphasis being, you do not follow a mere man. This is the Son of God. In Mark 9, 14 to 29, Jesus is building the faith of his disciples when they could not free a little boy from a demon. In verse 19, Jesus says, O faithless generation. Verse 22, the father of the boy says, but if you can do anything, but if you can, to which Jesus replies, if you can, all things are possible to the one who believes. When the disciples question why they had failed, Jesus replies, this kind can only be driven out by prayer. The whole event is an experience of building the faith, not just of the man, but of the disciples. Mark 9, 30 to 37, record Jesus explaining his approaching death and resurrection, followed by a discussion about who is greatest in the kingdom of God. And Jesus defines greatness as servanthood. Mark 9, 38 to 50, talk about a conflict and temptation. Jesus finished with these words in verse 50. Salt is good, but if the salt has lost its saltiness, how will you make it salty again? Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another. This is a reference to the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus associated salt and Christians with doing good works. Do you see the flow of what Jesus is doing? He is moving through discipleship, talking about his death and resurrection, talking about following him, building faith, and being obedient. Mark chapter 10. Jesus has a conversation about marriage and divorce, and in so doing reaffirms his Father's design in Genesis 1. In the next verses, Jesus again affirms childlike faith as the type of faith needed to enter the kingdom of God. Mark 10, 17 to 31 is an encounter Jesus has with a rich young man who is seeking to know how to enter the kingdom. Jesus' answer reveals that the path to God is found in removing idols from your life, in this case the man's wealth, and completely surrendering everything to God. When the disciples say, well, hey, we've left everything to follow you, Jesus reminds them that they have of all the things that they have received. And it concludes with this throwback to discipleship and servanthood. Verse 31, but many who are first will be last, and the last first. Mark 10, 32 to 45 find Jesus again communicating his approaching death and resurrection. And then we get this uncomfortable request from James and John and their mother. We covered this story in detail in our Matthew podcast on Matthew 20. For our purposes of discipleship, note verses 43 to 44. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be the slave of all. Mark then concludes this time of Jesus and the disciples walking to Jerusalem with the story of Bartimaeus, who follows Jesus. So as you read chapters 8, 9, and 10 this week, I hope that you will take note of how Jesus elevates and describes discipleship, how he highlights faith and obedience, his death and resurrection, trusting him, submitting to him, the themes of servanthood and commitment. And I hope that you will be inspired as you follow Jesus in a more significant way. Well, that's it for today. May you find great joy in the journey of reading the Bible.